The bulldozer driver killed the engine at exactly 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, and Denise Caldwell stood at the edge of what used to be my grandfather's orchard, clipboard against her chest, and said, "Mr. Kessler, the board voted 6-1. These terraces are blocking 42 homes from a $2.3 million view corridor. It's not personal." 42 homes, $2.3 million. I remember those numbers because she said them like a real estate listing, like the 130-year-old stone steps under her boots were a line item. By the time the first rain came that October, 300 tons of hillside would already be sliding toward Maple Ridge Court. By the time this was over, Denise Caldwell would be paying restitution on a number so much bigger than $2.3 million that the judge would have to say it twice. And almost none of that number would come from the bulldozer. I want to tell you right now, I didn't raise my voice that afternoon. I didn't threaten her. I just watched the machine crawl up the hill my great-grandfather terraced by hand in 1888, and I thought about the letter sitting in my file cabinet, dated 14 months earlier, with my signature and my engineering license number at the bottom, warning this exact board that those terraces were the only thing keeping their subdivision's foundations dry. They never read it. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. Because Denise Caldwell wasn't looking at rocks and dirt that day. She was looking at a spreadsheet nobody else had seen yet. A spreadsheet that would eventually put her in a courtroom instead of a country club. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 66 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed geotechnical engineer, the kind of man who gets called out to look at cracked foundations and washed out roads after the news crews go home. I know what a hillside does when you take away what's holding it up. I knew it the day they started the engines. I just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost Denise Caldwell to find out the hard way, and how much of that hillside, on paper, still belonged to me. The orchard sat above Cedar Hollow Estates, on 40 acres my great-great-grandfather, Amos Kessler, cleared with a mule and a stone hammer back in 1888. He didn't plant fruit trees in straight rows down a slope like some fool from back east. He cut terraces into the hillside first, 11 of them, dry stacked limestone walls, each one catching the water before it could run wild, each one holding 6 feet of good black soil that would have washed into the valley a century ago without them. Amos used to tell his sons the terraces were the orchard's bones. Take away the bones, he said, and the flesh goes wherever gravity wants it to go. I grew up climbing those walls. I can still feel the exact texture of that limestone under my palm, cool in the morning, warm by afternoon, rough enough to skin a 10-year-old's knee if he wasn't careful. My grandfather built a work table out of black walnut in 1899, the same year he married my great-grandmother, and that table still sits in the packing shed at the top terrace, scarred with 70 years of pruning shears and apple crates. 3 generations of Kesslers are buried in the family plot at the orchard's north corner, under a hackberry tree that's older than the state highway below it. My father is there. My mother is there. My older brother, who died in Korea before he ever got to plant a tree of his own, is there too. When my dad passed in 1991, he left me the orchard and the water rights that came with the old homestead patent, 40 acres, 11 terraces, and a deed that predates the subdivision below it by 60 years. Cedar Hollow Estates didn't exist when Amos Kessler cut those first walls. The developers who built it in the 1970s knew the orchard sat above them. They knew the terraces were doing something. They just never asked what. I never sold. I never let the orchard get swallowed into anybody's homeowners association either, even though half the board over the years tried to convince me the community aesthetic would benefit from bringing my land under their covenants. I always told them the same thing. My grandfather never signed a single agreement with anybody below this hill, and neither will I. What they didn't understand, what almost nobody understands until it's too late, is that a private easement for slope stabilization doesn't disappear just because a board of 5 volunteers with a landscaping budget decides it's inconvenient. Denise Caldwell became HOA president 3 years before that bulldozer showed up. She drove a white Range Rover with a vanity plate that said CEDARQN. She wore tailored blazers to community meetings held in a clubhouse that smelled like new carpet and burnt coffee, and she carried that clipboard everywhere like it gave her the authority of a courtroom judge. Before Cedar Hollow, she'd run a small property management outfit that got quietly dissolved after an insurance dispute nobody in the neighborhood ever asked too many questions about. She was smart, she was patient, and she had found, in the unobstructed valley views clause, buried in a landscaping amendment nobody read closely, the excuse she needed to knock down a 130-year-old stone wall and open up view lot pricing on 42 properties she didn't own, yet. I didn't know about the money at first. Nobody did. All I knew, standing there in the diesel exhaust with my letter in a filing cabinet a mile away, was that she'd just ordered heavy equipment onto lands that had 137 years of engineering logic and a deed standing in her way. She just didn't know that yet. And I decided, right there on that Tuesday afternoon, that I wasn't going to tell her. I was going to let her find out in front of everyone. Denise checked her clipboard again, tapping her pen against the top sheet like she was crossing off a chore. "We'll have the corridor cleared by Friday," she said. "Landscaping crews already scheduled to seed grass on the slope Monday. It'll look beautiful, Mr. Kessler. You'll thank us in the spring." A few neighbors had drifted up the access road to watch, the way people do when a machine that big starts making noise on a quiet street. Ed Pruitt from Maple Ridge stood with his arms crossed, squinting up at the stone walls like he was trying to remember why they mattered. "Denise," he called out, "you sure the county's fine with this? That's a lot of rock to just push over." "The county doesn't regulate private landscaping decisions inside an HOA," she said, without looking at him, like she'd rehearsed the line. "This is a beautification project." I almost laughed. Beautification. My great-great-grandfather didn't stack 11 limestone walls by hand across a hillside for beauty. He did it because his first year on that land, before the terraces existed, a summer storm had carried half his topsoil into the valley in one night. Amos used to say, "The ground remembers what you take from it. It just waits to give the bill." I thought about telling her that. I thought about walking up with the letter I still had memorized, dated, numbered, my license stamp pressed into the corner, and reading it out loud right there over the idling engine. Instead, I just nodded once, the way you do when you've already decided an argument isn't worth having with someone who isn't listening. "Do what the board voted for," I said. "I'll be around." She smiled at that, satisfied, like she'd won something. She had no idea what she'd actually started. Behind me, the operator fired the bulldozer's engine back up, and the first limestone wall, the one Amos built in the summer of 1888, cracked and folded forward into dust. The dust from that first wall hadn't even settled before the notice showed up. It came by certified mail on a Thursday, 3 days after the bulldozer went quiet for the weekend, and I remember the time because I was standing at my own mailbox at 11:32 a.m. when the carrier handed it to me and asked me to sign. Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, Notice of Violation, Case number 2024-0091. 42 acres of orchard, and somehow my name was on a covenant violation for a subdivision I had never joined. I read it twice, standing right there at the road. The letter claimed I was in breach of Section 7.3 of the Cedar Hollow Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, unmaintained vegetation creating a fire hazard, and it assessed a fine of $11,000 plus daily penalties of $200 until the hazard was remediated. Attached was a photocopy of a signature page, my signature, dated 2019. I never signed that page in my life. I want to be clear about something because this is the part most people get wrong when they think about fighting a homeowners association. They think the fight starts with yelling. It doesn't. It starts with paper. So I didn't call Denise Caldwell. I didn't drive to the clubhouse and pound on a table. I went inside, I made a pot of coffee, and I photographed that notice on my kitchen table at 11:47 a.m., timestamp visible in the corner next to the envelope it came in. Then I photographed the signature page under a magnifying lamp because 31 years of reading engineering drawings teaches you to look at lines the way most people never do. The signature had my name, but the pen pressure was wrong. My hand doesn't loop the K like that. I've signed 10,000 technical reports in my life. I know my own signature, the way I know the sound of my own voice. I drove to the county clerk's office that same afternoon and pulled the original recorded plat for Cedar Hollow Estates, filed in 1974, along with the amended declaration filed in 2019, the one my signature supposedly appeared on. The clerk, a patient woman named Carol, who'd been stamping documents there for 20-some years, pulled the file and set it in front of me without a word. I found what I was looking for on page 11. My name was listed as a consenting adjacent owner, but the notarization block had a stamp number that, according to the Texas Secretary of State's Public Notary Registry, hadn't been issued until 2021, 2 years after the date on the page. Whoever forged it hadn't even bothered to check when their own fake notary's commission started. I didn't say a word to anybody yet. I made copies. I mailed myself a set through certified mail, return receipt requested, the old trick lawyers taught me back in the 80s for establishing a time-stamped record when you don't have a notary handy. Postmark never lies. Then I sent a formal written response to the HOA's management company, again certified, return receipt requested, denying the violation, denying the signature, and requesting the original wet ink document under Texas Property Code Section 209.005, which gives a property owner the right to inspect HOA records. I kept a log, every letter, every date, every hour. I've built retaining walls that held back mountains because I trusted documentation over guesswork, and I trusted it here too. The first face-to-face came on a Tuesday at 2:47 p.m. because Denise Caldwell doesn't do anything at any other time. She came up the access road in the Range Rover, alone this time, no clipboard, just a manila folder pressed against her side like she thought it made her look official. "Walter," she said. First name now, like we were friends. "I think there's been some confusion about the notice." "There's been a forgery," I said. "That's a little more than confusion." She smiled the way people smile when they've decided you're being difficult instead of correct. "The board has broad authority to assess fines for community standards. I'm sure if you just clear the deadfall along your fence line, we can make this go away." "I'm sure you'd like that," I said. Because right now, what you've actually got is a document with a notary stamp that didn't exist when the document says it was signed. That's not a community standards issue, Denise. That's a Class A misdemeanor under Texas Government Code Section 406.017 if somebody used a fake notarization to defraud a property owner. And it's a felony if somebody used it to try to put a lien on my land. Her smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. Just a flicker. "I'll look into it," she said. "You do that," I said. "I've already got copies with the county." She left without another word, gravel popping under her tires the way it does when somebody's driving a little too fast for how calm they're trying to look. That night, I sat at my grandfather's black walnut table in the packing shed, the one built in 1899, and I went through every piece of paper I had. That's when I remembered the letter. The one I'd written 14 months before the bulldozer ever showed up, when the board first floated the idea of opening the view corridor. I'd sent it as a licensed geotechnical engineer, not just a neighbor. I pulled my old file cabinet drawer, smelling like dust and old ink, and found the carbon copy. Dated, numbered, my PE license stamp pressed into the corner just like I remembered. In it, I'd written, in plain language, that the terraces built into the slope above Cedar Hollow Estates functioned as a load-bearing drainage system, that removing them would eliminate the only engineered check against slope failure above 42 residential foundations, and that any modification without a licensed slope stability analysis would violate basic standards under the International Building Code's grading provisions as adopted by the county. I'd sent it certified. I had the green card back, signed by the HOA's management company, dated 14 months before the Bulldozer's engine ever turned over. They'd read it, they just hadn't cared. That's when I went further back to my father's file box, back to the original 1888 homestead patent and the 1963 easement my grandfather recorded when the county widened the access road below the orchard. And there it was, in language nobody at Cedar Hollow had apparently ever bothered to read. A recorded slope stabilization and drainage easement, granted in perpetuity, reserving to the Kessler family and their heirs the exclusive right to maintain, and prohibiting any party from altering, the terraced retaining structures upon the hillside above the platted subdivision known as Cedar Hollow. It was recorded in the county deed records in 1974, the same year the subdivision itself was platted. The developers who built Cedar Hollow had agreed to it 60 years ago because they needed my grandfather's water rights to get their own plat approved. Nobody currently on that board had any idea it existed. I'm not sure Denise Caldwell had ever read a single page of the deed history for the ground she was standing on. That was the small shield. My grandfather never signed on to their covenants, so their fines against me were worthless on their face. But the easement was the beginning of something bigger, and I didn't fully understand how big until I met Arlene Whitfield. Arlene lived 3 doors down from the base of the slope, in a brick ranch house with a wheelchair ramp her late husband built himself before he passed. She was 78, a widow, and she kept an oxygen tank on a little cart that squeaked when she pulled it across her kitchen floor. Her husband, Roy, had served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home, worked 30 years at the feed mill, and spent every Saturday of his retirement tending the memorial rose garden he'd planted along their side yard in his wife's honor the year their son died in a car wreck. Arlene told me all this sitting on her porch, oxygen line hissing softly, the day she flagged me down as I was driving past. "They want to buy my lot," she said. Denise came by herself, no clipboard even, real friendly. Said the board's got a view enhancement fund that could offer me $40,000 for the corner of my property where Roy's roses are. Said it'd help with my property taxes. She laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. $40,000 for a view I've had for free for 30 years, Walter. And she said if I didn't take it, the association might have to reassess my dues based on underutilized frontage. I don't even know what that means. I did know what it meant. It meant somebody had found a way to squeeze homeowners for cash under the cover of aesthetics. And it meant that View Enhancement Fund wasn't just clearing brush, it was buying up view lot frontage cheap, right before the slope behind those same lots was about to become the most valuable dirt in Cedar Hollow. I asked Arlene if she still had the letter with the board's offer in writing. She did, kept every piece of paper anybody ever sent her, same as me. An old habit from raising a family on a feed mill salary. And on that letter, in fine print near the bottom, was a name I recognized from the county clerk's corporate filings I'd pulled 2 days earlier while looking for the forged declaration. Ridgeline Valley Partners, LLC, the same entity that had quietly purchased 42 view corridor building rights options from the HOA's landscaping fund over the past 18 months. For a total that, once I added up every recorded transaction, came to just over $2.4 million. Denise Caldwell wasn't just bulldozing an orchard for a nicer view, she was selling that view piece by piece before the paint even dried. And Arlene Whitfield's roses were sitting on the last unsold parcel she needed. Here's where it gets interesting. Once I saw Ridgeline Valley Partners tied to the same name circling Arlene Whitfield's rose garden, I stopped thinking about my own $11,000 fine altogether. That fine was a distraction, a small shield I could knock down with one letter to the county. The real question was bigger. How much money was moving through that landscaping fund, who was signing off on it, and what was Denise Caldwell willing to do to close the deal before anybody like me started asking questions out loud? I called a friend from my engineering days, a fellow named Curtis Boyle who spent 20 years doing forensic accounting for the State Attorney General's office before he retired to a lake house 2 counties over. I drove out one Saturday with a banker's box of copied HOA financial disclosures I'd pulled under Section 209.005. Every homeowner's legal right to inspect association records, whether the board likes it or not, and spread them across his kitchen table. Curtis didn't say much for the first hour. He just made notes on a yellow legal pad, glasses pushed up on his forehead, occasionally muttering a number under his breath. Then he set his pen down. "Walter," he said, "this landscaping fund took in about $600,000 in special assessments from homeowners over 3 years, supposedly for tree trimming and erosion control. But it paid out $1.8 million to a contractor called Ridgeline Site Services for slope clearing and grading services. That's the same operation that ran your bulldozer, isn't it?" "Same crew," I said. I recognized the logo on the truck door. "And Ridgeline Site Services shares a registered agent," Curtis said, tapping the legal pad, "with Ridgeline Valley Partners, the LLC buying up your neighbor's view lot rights. Same address, same agent. That's not a coincidence, that's a shell game. She's paying the contractor with homeowner assessment money, the contractor's owned by the same people buying the view rights cheap, and then those view rights get resold at market rate once the slope's cleared. I'd bet good money there's a kickback running straight to Denise Caldwell personally, probably disguised as a consulting fee or a board stipend that's way out of line for a volunteer position." $2.4 million all told, once you added the resale markups on those 42 lots. Curtis said it plain. "This isn't an HOA overstepping its authority anymore, Walter. This is wire fraud, and if any of that money crossed the state line electronically, that's a federal case. You need to be careful how you handle what you know, because if she figures out you're onto the money, she's going to get desperate." He was right about that faster than either of us expected. 3 days later, at 6:15 in the morning, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. A diesel engine idling at the base of the access road, and under it, the higher whine of an angle grinder. I got up there in my truck in under 4 minutes, camera already in hand, because by then I'd made it a habit to keep my phone charged and my dashcam running anytime equipment showed up near that hillside. What I found was Denise Caldwell standing beside her Range Rover in a fleece vest instead of her usual blazer, directing 2 men from Ridgeline Site Services as they cut through the padlock on the gate I'd installed across the access easement 2 weeks earlier. The same access easement recorded in 1974, the one giving the Kessler family exclusive right to maintain that hillside. I filmed the whole thing from 30 yards back, timestamp running 6:19 a.m. She never even looked over her shoulder to check if anyone was watching. That's the thing about people who've been getting away with something for a while. They stop expecting consequences. "Denise," I called out, walking closer, phone still recording. "That's a locked gate on a recorded private easement. You want to tell me what you're doing?" She didn't even flinch. "The board authorized emergency slope remediation," she said. "We had a geotechnical concern after the rain last week." "I'm the geotechnical engineer of record for this hillside," I said. "Nobody called me. And you don't have county permits for grading work on a slope this size. I checked yesterday. You'd need an approved erosion control plan under the county's Lands Development Code before anybody puts a blade back on this hill." For the first time since I'd met her, Denise Caldwell looked less like a woman in charge and more like a woman doing math she didn't like the answer to. "We'll get the permits retroactively," she said. "This is urgent. There's liability exposure for the association if that slope fails." "There's liability exposure right now," I said, "for cutting a lock on a fenced private easement. That's criminal trespass under Texas Penal Code Section 30.05. And it's also a violation of the county's stop work order I filed yesterday afternoon after the first bulldozer pass, which you'd know about if you checked your certified mail." I held up my phone. "I've got you on camera authorizing it." She stared at the phone for a long moment, then turned and told the 2 men to load the grinder back in the truck. They didn't argue. Nobody argues when the person paying them starts looking rattled. But she wasn't done. 3 days after that, the real ugliness showed up, and it wasn't aimed at me at all. It was aimed at Arlene Whitfield. I found out because Arlene called me herself, voice thin and shaking over the phone, oxygen hissing in the background louder than usual, like she'd been crying and it had thrown her breathing off. "They cut down Roy's roses," she said. "The whole side yard, Walter. Said it was encroaching vegetation from an HOA landscaping violation notice I never even got in the mail. I came home from my doctor's appointment and the whole bed was gone. 30 years of roses, Roy's memorial, gone in an afternoon." I drove over immediately. What I found in her side yard looked like a crime scene. Canes and root balls dragged into a pile at the curb, tire ruts from a skid steer cutting straight through what used to be a border of stepping stones Roy had laid by hand. And staked in the middle of the wreckage was a bright yellow HOA violation notice, dated that same morning, citing unauthorized landscaping encroaching on association-owned buffer zone. Except Arlene's deed, which I asked her to pull that same day, showed her property line extended a full 8 feet past where that rose bed had been. There was no buffer zone. There never had been. I sat with her a long time that afternoon. She kept asking why anybody would do that to an old woman who'd never given the association a moment's trouble in 30 years. I didn't have a good answer, except that Denise Caldwell needed that side yard clear because Arlene's lot line, once adjusted by a fraudulent buffer zone claim, would make her corner parcel look small enough that the $40,000 buyout offer would suddenly seem generous instead of insulting. It wasn't really about roses. It was about softening up an old woman with an oxygen tank until she signed something out of exhaustion. That's when I stopped being patient in the quiet, careful way I'd been patient and started being patient in a different way, the kind where you build a trap instead of just documenting a mess. I went to the county the next morning and filed a formal complaint with the Development Services Office, attaching my dashcam footage, the certified mail records of my original slope stability warning, the recorded 1974 easement, and Curtis Boyle's preliminary financial summary. I requested, in writing, that any further grading or equipment work on the hillside above Cedar Hollow Estates be halted pending a licensed geotechnical review, citing my authority as the PE of record and property owner under the easement. I also filed, separately, a criminal complaint with the County Sheriff's Office regarding the cut lock, attaching time-stamped video. Then I did something I hadn't done in 31 years of practicing engineering. I called a reporter. Her name was Priya Anand, worked the local watchdog beat for the regional paper, the kind of reporter who still shows up to zoning meetings nobody else bothers covering. I didn't hand her the whole story. I just told her there was a slope stability issue above a subdivision that might be worth watching, and that the county's next Board of Adjustment meeting, where the HOA's landscaping fund expenditures were up for a required annual disclosure, might be worth attending. I also went and sat with Arlene again, this time with a legal pad of my own. I helped her write, in her own words, a formal statement about the buyout pressure and the false buffer zone notice, and I helped her file her own complaint alongside mine. She signed it slow, hands shaking a little from age, not fear. "Are we going to win this, Walter?" she asked me, setting the pen down. "We're not going to win it," I told her. "The rain's going to win it. All we have to do is make sure everybody's watching when it does." I didn't tell her the rest of what I knew, that the National Weather Service had already issued an outlook for an unusually wet October. 3 storm systems stacked up over the coast, the first one due in 11 days. I didn't need to manufacture a disaster. Denise Caldwell had already spent 14 months building one bulldozer pass at a time. All I had to do now was make sure the permits, the notices, and the witnesses were in place before the sky did what I'd warned them, in writing, it was going to do. The rain started on a Wednesday night, 11 days after I filed my complaint, right on schedule with what the National Weather Service had been saying for over a week. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on my porch with a thermos of coffee and watched water sheet down what used to be 11 terraces, now nothing but bare, churned clay with grass seed that hadn't taken root yet. I'd seen 100 slopes fail in 31 years of engineering work. I knew the sound before it happened, a low groan, almost like the earth clearing its throat, and then a wet, heavy rush that doesn't sound like water at all. It sounds like something enormous rolling over in its sleep. By 4:40 a.m. Thursday, 300 tons of hillside came down on Maple Ridge Court exactly the way I told the board it would 14 months earlier, in a letter they'd filed away and forgotten. Mud buried 6 driveways up to the bumpers of the cars parked in them. It cracked the foundation slab under Ed Pruitt's garage clean through. It filled Arlene Whitfield's side yard, what was left of it, with 2 feet of the same clay that used to be held in place by Amos Kessler's limestone walls. Nobody was hurt. That's the only mercy in the whole thing. But 6 houses were declared structurally unsafe by county inspectors before lunch, and the County Emergency Management Office was on scene by 9, along with a sheriff's deputy, a code enforcement officer, and, because I'd made one phone call the night before when the forecast confirmed the first system was arriving, Priya Anand with a photographer. I stood at the top of the ruined hillside that morning in my rain jacket, watching the county's geotechnical consultant, a younger fellow named Marcus Rios I'd actually trained years ago, walk the slope with a clipboard, and I didn't say a word to him about what I already knew. I let him find it himself. 20 minutes later, he climbed back up, mud to his knees, and said, "Walter, this failed exactly where the terracing used to be. Somebody stripped an engineered retaining system off an active slope with no replacement drainage. This is textbook." "I know," I said. "I wrote that in a letter 14 months ago." He looked at me for a second. "You have a copy?" "I have the original," I said, "and the certified mail receipt showing the association signed for it." That afternoon, Cedar Hollow's board called an emergency meeting for that evening at the clubhouse, the same room with the new carpet and burnt coffee smell, because 42 homeowners, most of them furious, most of them standing in mud-soaked shoes, weren't going to wait for a scheduled quarterly session. Denise Caldwell tried to run that meeting the way she ran every meeting, from behind a folding table at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, blazer back on like nothing had happened. "I want to assure everyone," she said, voice smooth, practiced, "that the association is already coordinating with our landscaping contractor on emergency slope stabilization. We take this very seriously." That's when I stood up, at the back of a room packed with people who'd lost driveways and foundations that morning, and I walked to the front carrying a manila folder of my own, the same kind she used to carry. "Denise," I said, "before you talk about stabilizing anything, I think this room deserves to see what you already knew and when you knew it." I laid the letter on the folding table in front of her, the one dated 14 months earlier, warning the board in plain engineering language that the terraces were a load-bearing drainage system and that removing them would cause exactly what had happened to Maple Ridge Court that morning. Next to it, I laid the certified mail receipt, signed by the HOA's management company, same date range. Then I laid the recorded 1974 easement granting the Kessler family exclusive rights over that hillside. The document nobody on her board had apparently ever bothered to read before authorizing a bulldozer onto land they never had legal authority to touch in the first place. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when people realize they've been lied to for a long time. "Here's what most homeowners never think to check," I said, loud enough for the whole room, and what this board never checked either. An HOA's authority only extends to land the association actually controls. This slope was never association property. It was never covered by your covenants. Every fine issued against me, every notice sent to Arlene Whitfield, every dollar spent clearing this hillside was spent modifying land the board had no legal right to touch. Denise's face had gone the color of the clay outside. That easement is over 50 years old. It's not even relevant. "It's recorded, in perpetuity, in the county deed records," I said. "It's relevant every single day it's on file, whether anybody read it or not. That's when the county code enforcement officer, who'd been standing near the door with his own copy of the day's inspection report, stepped forward and asked Denise directly whether the association had obtained any grading permit before the work began. She didn't answer. Priya Anand, sitting 3 rows back with a notepad and a small recorder on the table in front of her, asked the same question out loud for the record. Still nothing. That's when the sheriff's deputy, who'd come to the meeting on a separate matter entirely, my earlier criminal trespass complaint over the cut lock, which had been sitting on a detective's desk for 2 weeks, walked up the center aisle with a folder of his own. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, "I need you to step outside with me. We have some questions about a financial disclosure filed with the county this afternoon related to Ridgeline Valley Partners." Curtis Boyle's numbers had made their way, through my county complaint, into the hands of the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Division earlier that week, and that afternoon's landslide had apparently accelerated a review that would otherwise have taken months. The DA's office had already subpoenaed the HOA's landscaping fund bank records and cross-referenced them against Ridgeline Site Services and Ridgeline Valley Partners LLC. Same registered agent, same address, same pattern Curtis had flagged sitting at his kitchen table. Denise Caldwell stood up slowly, clipboard sliding off the folding table and clattering to the floor. And for the first time since the day the bulldozer first started its engine, she didn't have a line ready. The deputy walked her out through a room of 42 homeowners in muddy boots, past Arlene Whitfield sitting in her wheelchair with her oxygen tank humming quietly beside her, past Ed Pruitt, past Priya Anand's camera flash catching her face at the exact moment she realized the meeting she'd called to control had turned into the meeting that ended her. 6 months later, in a county courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat, Judge Renata Alvarez read the plea agreement into the record. Denise Caldwell had pled guilty to 1 count of securities and commercial fraud under Texas Business and Commerce Code provisions covering the LLC transactions, 1 count of tampering with a governmental record for the forged 2019 signature page, and 1 count of criminal trespass for the cut lock on my gate. The judge ordered restitution to the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association and the affected homeowners in the amount of $3,150,000. And she said the number twice, once reading it off the order, and once more when she looked up to make sure Denise Caldwell understood exactly what she'd be paying for the rest of her working life. $3,150,000, not 2.3, more. Ridgeline Valley Partners principal, a developer named Grant Osei, who'd been quietly funneling kickback payments to Denise through a fake board consulting stipend, pled guilty to a separate fraud count and was ordered to pay $1.1 million of that total himself, along with forfeiting his interest in the 42 view lot options his company had purchased for pennies on the dollar. The HOA's management company, which had processed the forged declaration without ever verifying the notary stamp, lost its contract and its state license after a formal complaint I filed with the Texas Real Estate Commission. Denise received 7 years, with parole eligibility after serving a portion, and a permanent bar from serving on any homeowners association board or managing any residential property in the state of Texas. The $11,000 fine against me, and every fine issued against any homeowner under that forged declaration, was voided by court order the same week the DA filed charges. Arlene Whitfield's buffer zone violation was expunged, and the county ordered the association's insurance carrier to pay for full restoration of her side yard, roses included, using cuttings her son's old gardening partner had, it turned out, kept alive in his own yard for 30 years without either of them ever mentioning it. The rebuilding took the better part of a year. County engineers, working from my original stability report and a new survey I drew up myself, restored the terraces using the same limestone, much of it salvaged from where the bulldozer had shoved it downhill, stacked back into 11 walls the way Amos Kessler laid them in 1888. I stood at the top terrace the day they finished, running my palm along the new mortar joints, and the stones still felt the same, cool in the morning, the way it always had, holding 6 feet of black soil that wasn't going anywhere this time. Arlene Whitfield was elected the new president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association that spring, unopposed, the first item on her agenda being a full independent audit of every fund the association had ever managed. She sits on her porch most afternoons now, oxygen line humming, looking out over rebuilt rose beds that smell like something worth protecting again. I still climb up to the packing shed some mornings, run my hand over my grandfather's black walnut table, and think about how close 42 families came to losing their homes over somebody's idea of a nicer view. My father used to say, "The ground remembers what you take from it." I think about that every time it rains now, listening for the sound the earth makes when it's finally being held the way it was always meant to be held. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's a simple one. Read what's already recorded before you touch what isn't yours. Documentation outlasts arrogance every single time, and the people who dismiss an old man's warning letter usually end up reading it back to them in a room full of witnesses. There's still one name buried in Curtis Boyle's financial records that never made it into this case. A second LLC tied to a different subdivision 2 counties over, with the same registered agent, Grant Osei, used here. Whoever's running that one doesn't know I've already started pulling the paperwork.